Thus saith the Lord, stand ye in the ways, and see, and ask for the old paths, where is the good way, and walk therein, and ye shall find rest for your soul. You are now listening to the Old Paths Podcast, hosted by Brother Reggie Paige.
Peace and blessings to everyone once again, and welcome to the OP Podcast. AKA the Old Paths Podcast. And yes, OP is short for overpowered, and that's not because I am overpowered, but it is He, the Most High God, who is overpowered in a good and only sense. Thank you for joining me, and I am your host, Brother Reggie Paige, coming live from Los Angeles. And it's a nice sunny day for anyone that cares. But this will be episode 5, and today's topic is going to be a continuation of last week's episode, which was on influencing by example, from Booker T. Washington's book, Character Building. Now, the reason why I separated the speech into 2 parts was because I wanted to specifically dive deeper into the anti-city sentiments that Booker T. Washington shares. So, with that being said, let's just dive into the second part of Influencing by Example by Booker T. Washington. A large proportion of you are to go from here into great cities. Some of you will go into such cities such as Montgomery, and some perhaps will go into the cities of the north, although I hope that most of you will see your way clear to remain in the south. I believe that you will do better to remain in the country districts than to go into the cities. I believe that you will find it to your advantage in every way to try to live in a small town or in a country district rather than in a city. I believe that we are at our best in the country life, in agricultural life, and too often are at our worst in city life. Now, when you go out into the world for yourselves, you must remember in the first place that you cannot hold yourselves up unless you keep engaged and out of idleness. No idle person is ever safe, whether he be rich or poor. Make up your minds whether you are to live in the city or in the country district, that you are going to be constantly employed. So, if you have read Booker T. Washington's other works, such as Up From Slavery and My Larger Education, you will clearly see his favor towards the country or agricultural life over the city life. Now, if I'm letting the Holy Ghost call to my remembrance why he is not too fond of the city life, I believe he never really elaborates on it until now. Secondly, though he does acknowledge how some people do prefer the city life and some prefer the country life. That's why he tells them to make up their minds whether they're going to live in the city or in the country life. But whichever you prefer, you must be productive members of societies and never be idle, or how the Bible puts it, as being a sluggard. And this is a true statement he is making, because no matter where you go, you must work in order to eat and survive. And I like these 2 Bible verses that talks about being a sluggard. In Proverbs chapter 13, in the 4th verse, it says this: the soul of the sluggard desireth and hath nothing, but the soul of the diligent shall be made fat. And then you got 2 Thessalonians 3:10. For even when we were with you, this we commanded you, that if any will not work, neither should he eat. And there ain't no 2 ways about it. It don't matter if you grew up with money or without. If you ain't trying to work, you ain't going to eat, especially living in a country like America. And pick on this next part in the next paragraph on what Mr. Washington is going to say about those people who live in America. And FYI, let's keep in mind, this is written between the span of the 1890s to, I believe, 1902, if I'm not mistaken. So keep that in mind. Booker T. Washington states this: in a rich and prosperous country like America, there is absolutely no excuse for persons living in idleness. Right? I have little patience with persons who go around whining that they cannot find anything to do. Especially is this true in the South. Where the soil is cheap, there is little or no excuse for any man or woman going about complaining that he or she cannot find work. You cannot set proper examples unless you yourselves are constantly employed. See to it, then, whether you live in a city, a town, or in a country district, that you are constantly employed when you are not engaged in the proper kind of recreation or in rest. Unless you do this, you will find that you will go down as thousands of our young men have gone down, as thousands of our young men are constantly going down, who yield to the temptations which beset them. Again, this man ain't never lying on this point. If this man is saying how rich in America and prosperous America is back in the late 1890s to the early 1900s, and he's saying this, by the way, as a so-called black man in the 1890s to the early 1900s, then what is our excuse, old man? We have so much opportunities here, whether they are desirable or not. There are jobs out there that renders your life inexcusable for you to find at least one job. Again, it doesn't matter if it's not your dream job. A job is a job, and if you need one, find one, because there is labor all around us, especially in America. And let me add this. I need y'all to also remember that in the first part of the speech, he was witnessing a group of young so-called black men whose mission was to be true and high-minded gentlemen with an added purpose of not only bettering themselves, but also helping other troubled so-called black men to get them on the right track. And I urge y'all to call that to your memory, because if you're trying to influence others for good, how can you do that when you're so lazy to get a job, when you're bumming it around? When you are someone who constantly makes excuses to not go to work and be a degenerate, how can you influence others to be a good and high-minded individual? Now, going back to being idle or a sluggard, when someone chooses to be idle and make excuses, all they do is make themselves open to the sins that so easily besets them. And why is that? It is simply because they had nothing else better to do but to be busybodies. And this is very unfortunate to read that, just like in our current societies, even back in Booker T. Washington's day, many so-called black men adhered to the culture of idleness and excuse-making. Just like in his days, as Booker T. Washington stated, as thousands of our young men are constantly going down who yield to the temptations which beset them, sadly, thousands of our young so-called black men have gone down and yielded to the sins that so easily besets them. And this is indeed a caution of the results of being idle. The Bible even warns us in 2 Thessalonians, the 3rd chapter of the 11th verse, for we hear that there are some which walk among you disorderly, working not at all, but are busybodies. And then you see a similar correlation in 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 13. And withal, they learn to be idle, wandering from house to house, and not only idle, but tattlers also, and busybodies, speaking things which they ought not. And I guarantee we know folks like this, who they just sit and play video games all day and smoke weed and get drunk all day, going from house to house, hoping that you're home so they could just sit and bum it out with you, gossiping and doing nothing, talking a whole lot of nothing too. Booker T. Washington continues. Refrain from staking your earnings upon games of chance. Yeah, I hope you heard that, all of you brothers that be parlaying every week. Especially my brothers that always be spending their hard-earned money trying to hit that parlay, only hitting once out of every 20 parlays, right? Yeah, brother, that message for you. But he continues, see to it that you pass by those things which tend to your degradation. Teach this to others. Teach those with whom you come in contact that they cannot lead strong moral lives unless they keep away from the gambling table. See to it that you regulate your life properly, that you regulate your hours of sleep. Have the proper kinds of recreation. And this is nothing but pure facts. How are you spending your time? Are you wasting your precious time doing dumb stuff, or are you actually scheduling your time wisely? I can speak for myself. Back in college, I had a lot of young men energy to go to class all day, do homework and study in between, go to work all night, then fool around with the homies doing whatever, whether it's be playing video games all night, getting high, getting drunk, playing pool, playing spades, making music, partying, or I'm just hanging out with some girl that I'm messing with until like 2 or 4 o'clock in the morning. And then wake up at 8 a.m. just to do the same thing all over again. But about 2 years ago, about 2, 3 years ago, I burnt out trying to do all that same stuff I did in high school. And the reason why I burnt out was because, one, I got saved and replaced a lot of my partying and drinking and high days with Bible study and church. But secondly, I'm getting older. I have learned from firsthand experience that it was a vain and dangerous lifestyle to wake up early and to stay up late fooling around. It's so much more profitable things we can do if we actually care about living a strong and moral life. And because this is a Christian podcast, the only way you'll be able to live that type of life is if you choose to walk with Christ as your Lord and Savior, and who died for your wicked sins, you wicked sinners. But many of us will waste our money and our lives trying to hit that parlay, trying to party all night, watching TV all night, doing things that give us a cheap thrill and regretful nights as we get older. And I'm just speaking from my own life experience. But I know for sure, that I'm not the only one that has lived that type of life before. We must regulate our lives properly and make sure we do not miss out on our beloved rest. In Psalms, the 127th chapter of the first and second verse, it states this: "Except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. Except the Lord keep the city, the watchman waketh but in vain." It is vain for you to rise up early, to sit up late, to eat the bread of sorrows, for so he giveth his beloved sleep. See, the Bible even talks about that beloved sleep, that beloved rest that we so often neglect. But the best way we can keep ourselves out of trouble and keep that beloved rest is if we keep ourselves not idle, out of trouble, of vanity and vices, and get that proper sleep. Now, here is where I want to take a detour on the topic of idleness, for Booker T. Washington goes to elaborate on why he does not care too much for the city life. He says this: "Quite a number of our young men in the cities stay up until 12, 1, and 2 o'clock each night. Sometimes they are at a dance, and sometimes at the gambling table, or in some brothel, or drinking in some saloon. As a result, they go late to their work, and in the short time, you hear them complaining about having lost their positions. They will tell you that they have lost their jobs on account of race prejudice, or because their former employers are not going to hire colored help any longer. But you will find, if you learn the real circumstances, that it is much more likely they have lost their jobs because they were not punctual or on account of carelessness." So here, we are revealed to Booker T. Washington's anti-city beliefs. Reason number one is that the cities tend to never sleep. For example, New York City is known as the city that never sleeps. But what does that really mean for us? In cities, there is always something to do even past midnight. However, the things that are open in those late hours of the night are usually things that feed our vices, which goes into reason number two for Mr. Washington's anti-city sentiment. Young men and even women are up all night going to dances, and we know them as clubbing, or going to the gambling dens, going to bars to get drunk all night, and even going to brothels, which we still have today, whether it be the stroll or what we know as the strip clubs, which are nothing but mere brothels. Because of this never sleeping and living up your sinful pleasures all night lifestyle that is so prevalent in many of the cities, Booker T. Washington's reason number three on why he is anti-city is that many young folks are not productive members of societies, or they're just plain bad workers. And I know this from firsthand experience. As for myself, I always had shared very similar sentiments on why I prefer small town life over life in the big metropolises. I have never been a fan of big cities, especially living in Los Angeles. I never was a fan of going to bars, bar hopping, and staying out all night. Naturally, I suppose I am very introverted and love being secluded. Even back when I did drink, I don't drink no more. I'm about 4 years sober, or maybe 3. I don't remember. But even back when I did drink and party, it was usually small shindigs at the crib with some close friends. Now, funny enough, after I got saved, I moved over to Koreatown. If anybody knows anything about Los Angeles, Koreatown is literally down the street from downtown LA. And I dreaded living there because it was nothing fancy about it. The streets were dirty, unsafe, expensive to live at, fast paced in the ways that causes people to try and compete with each other instead of uplifting each other. So the sense of community was not really there. And I still can't fathom why people acted like that area was Atlantis or something. I just don't understand why people were willing to pay, $2,000 in rent for a 1-bedroom apartment that looks dirty, just so they can live in downtown or near downtown. It's not even that beautiful compared to a country life, right? A small town life where you are able to see nature. I used to live in Charlotte, North Carolina. And Charlotte is not really a big city. It's a small town compared to Los Angeles, especially. And you are able to see nature, right? You still have beautiful trees. And just Los Angeles is just not a fun place. But the place I live currently, which is called Bellflower, which is about 30, 40 minutes away from downtown LA, Bellflower really has a small town feel. No big skyscrapers, not that many people there. It's a little bit more neighborly. It has a sense of community. Even its downtown area reminds me of a small town in the South, right? No big skyscrapers. It has that small town feel. Now, going back to an interesting thing on the anti-city beliefs of Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington was actually not the only prominent figure that held these beliefs towards cities. Former President Thomas Jefferson actually held the same sentiments. Thomas Jefferson states this: "I am not a friend to placing growing men in populous cities," writes Jefferson to Dr. Casper Worcester on the 21st of June, 1807, "because they acquire habits, partialities which do not contribute to the happiness of their afterlife." Years earlier, on September 23rd of 1800, he says to Dr. Benjamin Rush, "I view great cities as pestilence to the morals, the health, and the liberties of men. True, they nourish some of the elegant arts, but the useful ones can thrive elsewhere, and less perfection in the others. With more health, virtue, and freedom would be my choice." He says this to David Williams in November 14th, 1803. He states that the cities encourage too many citizens to try to live by their heads and not by their hands. That is, they discourage husbandry and self-sufficiency. And I always found this comment very true and interesting for many folks who live in the cities, do not know how to use their hands for work. Actually, if you ever lived in places like Los Angeles, they scoff at those who prefer freedom and working with their hands. The city life culture almost has this elitist mentality where being a plumber is viewed as a low-level job. Being a garbage man worker is viewed as a low-level job, while working in human resources for some corporate company is a high-level job. Being an electrician is lower than a Hollywood actor, right? Being someone who actually knows how to cook their own meals and not go out and eat fast food or eat out at restaurants every day is uncommon. Why? Because the trend in cities is that you got to go to all these trendy restaurants, these fancy restaurants that, to be honest, even as a chef myself, and I guess this podcast is sponsored by Dr. Paige's Homemade Gumbo. But even a lot of these trendy restaurants, they be just doing stuff just to do it. Like the other day, I saw that this restaurant was going to make a peach cobbler waffle with fried chicken, and they put it all together. I said, that looks so disgusting. And I just thought to myself, people just be doing anything just so they can seem like they can stand out. You know what I mean? But besides all that, people in the city, they gravitate towards just doing something trendy. What's the hottest thing out there? Nothing really meaningful. Just vanities of vanities. All is vanity, right? Growing your own food is discouraged. not really something that, I mean, people talk about that they need to grow their own food in the cities, but over time they're going to give up on that and go to the grocery stores. And they'll just go to Simply Wholesome, not Simply Wholesome, but Trader Joe's or something like that, just so they can feel better because they don't know how to grow their own things, right? And this is not for everybody, So if this does not regard you, don't be getting all butthurt. But many people in the cities, this is how they act, right? Going back to Jefferson, that is for Jefferson, the city was an impossible state of affairs for human happiness. They also they bode ill for any who have a turn for dissipation. So great was his enmity of cities that in the 1800 letter to Rush, he states that the yellow fever epidemic that hit Philadelphia and wiped out a large number of its citizens might just be Providence's way of discouraging the growth of great cities in our nation. And I mean, that makes sense. That makes sense. I honestly agree, especially when you have people living on top of each other like sardines. I mean, if you have a disease, I mean, we just recently dealt with a epidemic, quote unquote. But I mean, just think about it. Most people in the cities were taking the largest hits in these epidemics. Why? Because everybody is literally right next to each other, squeezed next to each other, living on top of each other, right? And as well as the cities are dirty, right? The cities are dirty. Cities are probably home to very unhealthy lifestyles too. You know what I mean? Fast food living, going out to eat. I mean, just, you already know. But again, for both Booker T. Washington and Thomas Jefferson, cities marked a sort of natural decay because cities slipped away from the agrarian ideal that Jefferson and Washington consistently beholden dearly. In cities, that degree of freedom that gives citizens, as Jefferson states, a wholesome control over their public affairs is absent. What is missing? Jefferson tells John Adams on the 28th of October of 1813, the thing that's missing is ownership and care of land, which conduces to law and order. And if we know anything about old America and Booker T. Washington, they were very much advocates for people to own land. Before everybody had the right to vote, or the privilege to vote, the people who were allowed to vote were not only just white men, but white men that owned land. It was not just every white man was able to vote. It was white men that were able to own land. And when black people were able to vote, black people that owned land. Again, you had to own land in order to vote, which means that voting was a privilege. Anyway, but in the cities, it's extremely hard and not really promoted to own land. Owning land, citizens come to know its true value. The yield of arable land is plentiful and will wish to defend it in times of intra or international strife. The mobs in cities, and a mob, according to the dictionary, is a mere instrument of those with rank and birth, wallow in ignorance, poverty, and vice, and thus are incapable of rational activity. The mobs of great cities add just so much to the support of pure government as swords do to the strength of the human body, writes Jefferson in Query XIX of his notes on the state of Virginia in 1787. To James Madison in the same year, Jefferson writes on December 20th, he writes, "I think we shall be virtuous as long as agriculture is our principal object, which will be the case while there remain vacant lands in any parts of America. When we get piled upon one another in large cities, as in Europe, we shall become corrupt as in Europe and go to eating one another as they do there." And again, if you love this city life, you probably don't see this being a problem, but most of the major cities in America are filled with so much sin. Look at New Orleans, look at Dallas, look at Baltimore, look at Chicago, look at Los Angeles, look at San Francisco, look at Portland, look at New York City. These cities don't have a great reputation, and honestly, most of the worst things happen there due to the vices and that settles there as both Washington and Jefferson states. People forget how to live off the land and how to become self-sufficient. Simply put, for me, people prefer security rather than freedom, which is why they prefer law and order by the government. Why they rather have the government provide for them rather than them learning how to provide for themselves. Jefferson's anti-city arguments are several, but one stands out. He says this: cities offer an unnatural overcrowding of citizens, and where there is overcrowding and land is wanting, the spirit of commerce and attention to making money burke the desires for liberty and for living off the land. Right? He states this in more of his query notes on the state of Virginia. Jefferson assumes an atypical somber tone. He says this: from the conclusion of this war, we shall be going downhill. The people and their rights will be forgotten. Excuse me. They will forget themselves, but in the sole faculty of making money, and will never think of uniting to effect a due respect for their rights. And we see this so much today because, again, I say many people prefer security, easy money, and more pleasurable life rather than freedom and hard work and a simple but more fulfilling life. Many people have forgotten their freedoms today and want the government to rule their lives and be their king. And that's not how God, the Most High God, wanted it, neither how some of the founding fathers wanted it to be either. If they were to see America today, they would probably shake their heads in sheer disappointment. And now, I don't want to leave you in doom and gloom. I mean, it's pretty much too late, but I believe that Jefferson did have a plan in mind of what to build instead of these grandiose metropolises. Jefferson, he proposed in a letter to Comte de Volney on the 8th of February, 1805, the checkered board for the plan for building in towns to discourage diseases by making a town similar to the country. Jefferson puts it like this: I have supposed it is practicable to prevent its generation by building our cities on a more open plan. Take, for instance, the checkerboard for a plan. Let the black squares only be building squares, and the white ones be left open, in turf and trees. Every square of house will be surrounded by 4 open squares, and every house will front an open square. The atmosphere of such a town will be like that of a country insusceptible of the diseases which produced yellow fever. Jefferson adds in the letter to Volney that the checkerboard plan is being considered for extensions of New Orleans. The governor of New Orleans Territory, William C.C. Claiborne, wrote Jefferson in August 30th, 1804, of the score of elegance and comfort of health of its design. Claiborne said he would spare no pains to impress its excellencies on the mind of those citizens whose influence will be serviceable. Claiborne's assurance, notwithstanding, there is no evidence that the influential citizens of New Orleans ever seriously entertained the Jeffersonian grid for its extensions. So many cities like New Orleans, Jackson, Mississippi, and others were going to try Jefferson's checkerboard city plan. But as we can tell, the plan never really came to fruition, despite many raving on how elegant and comforting the plan was. Overall, the plan was that the states would have more small town feels, and more small towns rather than a few and a grand city where the majority of the state's populace will live. These are some things I hope I have brought to your mind clearly, because these are topics that really don't get talked about enough in depth. The topic is usually just, I prefer the city and I prefer the country, and that's the extent of the conversation, and, of course, some stereotypes, and that's it. But I do hope that these anti-city arguments open some eyes to those who actually do live in cities, to be cautious of their surroundings and actually consider the small town or country as not just for some quote-unquote dumb hillbillies. Let's go back to Booker T. Washington. We're almost done. Booker T. Washington, he states this: Then, 2, you will find that you will go down if you yield to the temptations of indulging in strong drink. That is carrying a great many of our young men down. I do not say that all our young men are of this class or that all of them yield to the temptations, because I can go into many large other cities and find just such men as those in Cincinnati to whom I have referred. You cannot hope to succeed if you keep bad company. As far as possible, try to form the habit of spending your nights at home. There is nothing worse for a young man or young woman than to get into the habit of thinking that he or she must spend every night on the street or in some public place. I want you, as you go out from these institutions, whether you are graduates or not, whether you have been here 1 year or 4 years, to go out with the idea that you must set a high example for everyone in your community. You must remember that the people are watching you every day. If you yield to the temptations of strong drink, of going into bad company, or others will do the same thing. They will shape their lives after you. You must so shape your lives that hundreds and thousands of those who are looking to you for guidance may profit by your example. And there's nothing more that needs to be said, because what he ends with is self-explanatory. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 33 states this: "Be not deceived. Evil communications corrupt good manners." Again, if you keep bad company around, they will corrupt you. Remember the story of Lot, where he lived in Sodom and Gomorrah, and righteous Lot was so corrupted that the way the people were acting in Sodom, wanted to rape the angels and were acting like an angry mob, their actions was normal to him, to the point that he was willing to offer his daughters to the mob. And don't think this example is a little too extreme, because how many young men who are upright engage in the most surprising situations because they chose to befriend the children of disobedience. We too should also form habits of spending our nights at home, because we are less tempted into getting caught up with the ways of the world. Another extreme example, I have a couple of female friends that I grew up with and went to school with that used to be always out and about until late hours of the night. One of my friends, she got caught up with some guy and he pimped her out. My other friend, who used to hang out with strangers and party all night, got kidnapped. And thank God they found her alive 2 states over in the trunk of someone else's car. And again, we hear stories like this often, and sadly, I know people that got caught up in the wrong things because they want to be night owls. If you have a family at home, people, when the sun moves to the other side of the world, go home. If you're single and it's night and you're bored, stay home and entertain yourself at home. Because at the end of the day, if you are striving to be the best person, to be used by God, do you want to be the best example because you are living a true and high-minded life? Or do you want to be a cautionary tale like many others who yielded to the temptations that so easily beset them because they became idle and became busybodies? The choice is yours. And hey, that's just the low-down gospel truth. Thank you, and be with me next time. But if you enjoyed this episode, please do like, comment, and subscribe, and share the knowledge to your friends and family. Remember, the truth shall make you free. May the God of all knowledge have mercy and grace upon you all. Peace.